It's time. Penn State Blitz and the Penn State Blitz podcast. I'm Bob Flounders of PennLive, of course, joined by Greg Pickel, who, as always, is here to provide us with all the latest up-to-date Penn State recruiting information, as well as what's going on with the Penn State program. I'll chime in as well. A lot to get to this week, even though there's no football. It never stops, Greg. We're going to talk about, we just had a chance to meet with James Franklin via Zoom to get his thoughts on what happened with the Big Ten postponement to 2021 decision. We're going to talk about the state of the Big Ten. It's not pretty. We'll get into that. Just your thoughts on maybe what stood out highlight-wise from what James had to say. And then we're gonna close with the Penn State mailbag as we get close to mid-August. The Penn State Blitz and the Penn State Blitz podcast. Greg, we just heard from James Franklin, and he had a lot to say about a lot of different things. Really our first chance to hear from him since the postponement. What were your thoughts kind of on how he handled his Q&A via Zoom with the media?
Yeah, obviously, I think, Bob, we knew based on his comments prior to the Big Ten decision that he was pretty frustrated with the way things were heading. And then we didn't hear from him at all after the decision was announced. It turns out that he was getting ready after a negative COVID-19 test to drive down to be with his family in Florida and spend some time with them after everything went down. So I was a little bit surprised by the fact that, he was very outright and very forthright still about the need to fight for the players. And I guess surprise isn't the right word, but, he was very much in lockstep with a lot of the Big Ten coaches around the conference who just really wished that this had played out a better way. Obviously, he said he wasn't stunned by the decision, but wished that the process that led to it would have been better and that the timing would have been different in terms of waiting to make a call about a postponement. But, Bob, I think he answered the question that was on so many people's minds, and that was a pretty simple one. Does he think the petitions and the parents' associations and everybody else will make this change happen? And the answer is just simply no.
Yeah, he also, it was a pretty wide-ranging interview. He was asked a little bit about the plausibility of a spring season. And there's a lot of variables there, Greg. I don't know that you can really have a spring season, maybe if the other three conferences that are planning on playing get a season in the fall, that would really, I think, probably dilute the product in the winter or the spring. It would probably be winter, not spring. They keep saying spring. But I think James is a big planning guy and a big framework guy. And I think James doesn't want to talk about a scenario unless someone can present to him, their idea of how it will play out. And also, I think he wants to kind of have some input into it as well. I just got his vibe to me was, though, he was a little bit pessimistic about maybe pulling off a spring season if it turns out there is indeed no football for the rest of 2020.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the logistical challenges are numerous. For starters, you're going to have to figure out where these games can be played. Some Big Ten cities just are not, I don't think, going to be equipped to host outdoor games. State College may very well be one of them. I mean, this is a stadium that the pipes have frozen in November when it's not even as cold as it's going to get in State College. And they winterized part of the stadium because of how old some of the stuff in there is. And I just don't see how they could make the changes and upgrades necessary, especially with the amount of money being lost by a postponed season, to get this done in a relatively timely fashion to play in the winter. So that's why I think you heard him pitching from the start last week, this idea of playing in domes in different Big Ten cities or in cities close, within the Big Ten footprint. And that's obviously one thing that could work, and you could get all the TV people there and set up, and everything would work out in a reasonable way, you would assume, to play about 8 games maybe in the winter portion of the spring semester, and then come back and play in 2021. But there's just so much to decide at this point. And all told, you could just frustration just oozed from his words and from his just reaction to how all this played out.
Yeah, Greg, I would say what I picked up on was, James is dealing with, Penn State's football present, and that is trying to explain things to the current team and their parents. think he's also a little upset because he doesn't quite know what to tell his upperclassmen, his seniors, and maybe his fourth-year juniors that have a chance to play at the next level with regard to how to approach, getting ready for the NFL. But there's also the younger players on his team that eventually are going to play again, and their parents. And also, he is always has his eye on the ball when it comes to recruiting, whether it's, the next couple of classes and identifying prospects, but he also has to deal with recruits, verbal commitments, and their parents. And to be, more than a week away from what the Big Ten decided, and them still not really have any kind of explanation, any kind of window into the decision. He also seemed to get a little bit fired up. There's 3 conferences still trying to play in the fall, Greg, and they have a different kind of workload than the conferences that have postponed. There's talk, I think, about maybe 12 hours per week, and he did not seem like he thought that was very equitable. We could sense his frustration, and it's really, Greg, it's hard to blame him.
Yeah, no question. I mean, as you heard him say, he usually likes to be upfront with the parents and the coaches and the players and the recruits and everybody else about what comes next. And he doesn't have those answers right now. I mean, we talked to him Wednesday morning. We're recording this shortly afterwards. So the NCAA Division I Council is supposed to meet today, Wednesday, August 19th, and decide, among other things, maybe some eligibility issues in terms of whether they'll freeze a year of eligibility or not. They have to decide what the schools in the Pac-12 and the Big Ten that aren't playing, what they're allowed to do in terms of countable hours a week with the coaches, with the strength and conditioning staff, and so on and so forth. So, again, there's so many things that need to be figured out, and that was one of the reasons I think James Franklin pushed for a delay more than anything. It wasn't to, obviously he wants to play. All these guys want to play. But to me, Bob, the decision was more about if we are going to do this and postpone, let's make sure we can answer some simple questions related to scholarship counts and extra years of eligibility and everything else before we go ahead and do it.
Yeah, and clearly that didn't happen. Also, James's comments, they come on the heels of something you wrote last week about Sandy Barber not even sure if the presidents actually voted. It just, as we kind of pivot just to talking about the Big Ten in general, I mean, this is, I don't know that it's true anymore, but a lot of people looked at this as kind of maybe of all the power conferences, the one that was kind of the leading model. And they've just really fallen flat during the pandemic. No communication, no foresight, no real explanation of plans. They come out with a schedule and less than a week later, or roughly a week later, they're pulling the plug on the season. You don't know if the presidents are talking with the ADs or if James Franklin's having any ability to maybe communicate to President Barron at Penn State. But when Sandy Barber says she's not even sure if they took a vote, Greg, that is really, really troubling. It does not reflect well on the conference that former Commissioner Jim Delaney created, but also kind of the way that the new commissioner, Kevin Warren, has handled things. It's a mess. I don't think there's any question about that. The fact that they haven't said anything since they decided to postpone, I don't know if they could be doing a worse job of showing transparency and trying to communicate with the schools that the 14 schools that are part of the conference, and it's leading to these explosions by the coaches and by the parents. Greg, I don't know that I could have ever foreseen a more poorly handled situation. And James referenced it. It's probably maybe the most important decision the Big Ten's ever made.
Yeah, there's no question. Certainly more important than the decision to add Maryland and Rutgers, because that's turned out so well. But that's for another podcast. Yeah, I think that one of the maybe problems here is that Kevin Warren is so new to the college football space. He's only been in this job for 8 months. He's been around football his whole life. He's clearly an extremely intelligent man who I think was the right pick for this job. But when it comes to this kind of stuff, and this was a couple national columnists have talked about this, Bob. The NFL is you don't see stuff like this happen in the NFL because they handle so much of their business internally. And college football just isn't like that. There's leaks, there's parents, there's players, there's recruits, there's coaches, there's support staff. I mean, there's all these people in the mix. And I just think that then you add in the presidents and the athletic directors and everybody else, there's a lot more chefs in the kitchen, so to speak. And when you blow the messaging and you let Ryan Day and James Franklin and John Harbaugh get out in front of you, you've lost any chance you're going to have of winning the public relations battle. And it was almost like instead of trying to fight back, they just gave up. They didn't even send a pitcher out for the next inning. They just went home. And it just doesn't really make any sense to me, Bob. I don't know who's advising those in charge of the Big Ten to take this strategy and take this path to nothingness, really. But it says a lot when the Pac-12 releases its entire medical reasoning for postponing the season. Big Ten can't even tell us what they used to get to this point, and if they even voted on getting to this point.
Yeah, very disappointing. Wish we had better news to share with the Penn State fans, but it is what it is. We're just relaying to you how the Big Ten has handled that, and as I said, we could talk. It's very clear that James Franklin handled himself well when we just spoke with him, but you could just tell it took a lot of. He was fighting. He was fighting, I think, some emotions. He did a good job, I think, of handling it, but you could tell he didn't. I don't know that he necessarily really spoke his mind the way probably he would have liked. Greg, we're about halfway through the Penn State Blitz podcast. You guys can always rate us and subscribe us. Greg, I know this is your favorite part of the Penn State Blitz and the Penn State podcast. You get to tell all of our listeners and our viewers how to make fun of us or tell us we're doing a good job. So why don't you take it away?
Let's do it, Bob. I got a special part to add to this week, and you don't even know about it yet. So it is the PennLive Penn State Blitz podcast, Apple, Spotify, Google, wherever you get your audio. And if you have found your way to Dustin Hawkinsmith's Penn State Today updates, Bob, you and I are going to be joining that rotation. The Blitz is going to be folded into that rotation. Ooh. So that's something to look forward to.
I think it's a long time in the making, a long time coming. I think it's probably the result of Penn State fans speaking out. That we've heard you. You want access to the Penn State Blitz in as many avenues possible. So we're going to oblige you. Great news, Greg. Let's get going here.
Let's not forget about YouTube, Bob. We didn't get to YouTube.
Oh, all right. Well, that's kind of your fault. Go ahead.
Yes, youtube.com/allpennstate. We're going to work on getting James Franklin's opening statement video posted there a little bit later. Our buddy Joe Herman is going to take care of that. Bob, before we move on, I just want to get your thoughts on that. I thought he was you could tell he had prepared some thoughts to share in that opening statement. Yeah,
and also I think you did reference the fact that he had made the decision to be away from his family, his wife Fumi and his two daughters, who I believe 12 and 13, Shola and Addie. One of them has an immune deficiency issue that has compromised her immune system. And, James back in the spring said it was a difficult decision, but he made the decision they have a separate residence, I believe, in Florida. His family stayed behind. He was going to be with his coaches and his players. That's a lot of people. And for the good of his family, he's been apart from them, since I would say May, maybe early June, whenever that was. That's a long time. But right after the Big Ten decision and right after he had tested negative for COVID, he made a 12-hour drive to go see them. And I think that probably explains one of the reasons why we didn't really hear from him right after the Big Ten announcement to postpone. But I also think James wisely probably needed maybe a little while to kind of gather his thoughts, stay on message, and not say. A couple of coaches came out strongly right after it. Probably didn't handle it the best way in terms of either wanting to play or being a little bit unusually critical maybe of the Big Ten. So I think James had a couple of reasons to do it the way he did it. But you're right, the statement covered a lot of topics. You can clearly tell. He also mentioned the community. He's worried about State College itself because no football in the fall is really going to probably devastate a very small area. They're very dependent upon the income generated from Penn State football weekends. It's a very lucrative business. He mentioned that as well. I thought that was good on him. I think he legitimately meant that. But there's just so many spokes in this wheel that he had to speak on and take questions on. So I think taking a week to maybe get it together and think about some things. And he's also dealing with parents and recruits and players. He always has a lot on his plate, Greg, but probably never more so than right now.
Yeah, no question about it. And again, the biggest frustration for him is not having answers. I think he can deal with an overloaded plate if he knows the direction that where things are going. But the problem is he's probably fielding phone calls left, right, and center, and all he can tell people is, I don't know. And that, I think, is the biggest issue at this point.
Yeah, for a guy that's always on schedule and always has a plan and has a contingency for everything, to have to see this happen to his conference, and he's, I don't want to use the word powerless because he's not, but it's got to be very frustrating for somebody who is so organized and always has a contingency to see the conference that he's in literally have the opposite in terms of plans or contingencies, or he's got no answers, like you said. And I don't know that he's going to have a lot more answers in the next week or two. It doesn't seem like the Big Ten's in a hurry to divulge anything, Greg. So we'll see how it plays out. But just a real disappointing it's been pretty disappointing for about the last month or so since this came out. Before we get to the Penn State mailbag, just real quick, there's been some rumors about the possibility of kind of a ad-libbed, shorter Big Ten season where maybe 5 or 6 teams band together and play a season or play a round robin. It's kind of made its rounds on social media. Dave Jones asked James about that, whether he had heard anything about that, and James was very clear in his answer, Greg.
Yeah, he was, and the answer was no. And I just don't see any way that's going to happen. I can certainly understand the push to want to make it happen. I can certainly understand why they would want that to be the case, but I just don't see any way that's going to work out. There's too many contract issues. There's too many scheduling issues. He said he let these guys go home, so that means they'd have to start quarantining all over again, which wouldn't be the end of the world. You could still play at the end of September, early October, but I think the ship has left the port, and it's way too far out to sea at this point to turn it around.
All right, let's close it down then, Greg, here on the Penn State Blitz and the Penn State Blitz podcast with the Penn State mailbag. I know it's kind of a big weekend for you. I'm going to wish you the best of luck. That's all I'm going to say. But I know you're going to be a changed man the next time we talk. Changed in at least one way, but we're not going to go any further into that. What are the pressing questions and comments from the Penn State football fans?
Yeah, Bob, once, we only got one this week that we can use because a lot of the ones that came in were questions that we were hoping James would have answers to, and he doesn't have them, so we could speculate all we want. Let me just note one thing before we get there. Even though Penn State football is not being played, Bob, just want to remind people we're not going anywhere. We got recruiting to write about. We got the developments that are going to keep coming up to write about. So your Penn State football fix will continue to be served throughout the fall, even though the team won't be on the field. More details about that soon. Bob, let's just wrap up with this. James was pretty straightforward about the fact that this idea that was put out by ESPN on Tuesday night, that there was going to be a recommendation made by the Football Oversight Committee, which Sandy Barber serves on, to allow the teams that don't play just 12 hours a week of work compared to the teams who do play that get more than that. He was pretty straight about the fact that he didn't think that was right. I can't think of any reason to disagree with him, but just what's your takeaway to that? Do you think they should give these teams that aren't playing more time with the coaches, with the weight room staff, so on and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a lot of ground to cover, even though they're not playing. Throw in the fact, Greg, that none of these teams in any of the conferences had spring practice. There are development issues related to that. There are teaching issues related to that. There's not going to be an August fall camp, obviously for the Big Ten in general, but especially with Sandy Barber on the committee. I mean, I would hope she would put up a nice fight, because I think that 12 hours is probably kind of ridiculous. I don't know how it would work out, but if 3 of the conferences are going to try and play a season and do play a season, and the Big Ten and the Pac-12 are relegated to 12 hours a week, and who knows if they're even going to play in the spring, Greg, they're going to be so far behind the 8 ball that it's just. Now you could say, well, they made the decision. That's the decision they made, but I mean, you have to accept the fact they made it with the health of the athletes and the coaches in mind, and so I don't think they should be penalized for that. And I think that 12 hours is probably, James is right. If that's going to be what Penn State's going to deal with, I mean, I just think it's going to be it's going to be a rough next couple of years for the Big Ten Conference. My hope is that since Sandy's on the committee, I hope she speaks her piece and really kind of fights for what James and probably the rest of the Big Ten wants.
All right, Bob, let's just get to it. I got a wedding to prepare for. You have a reception to prepare. You have a reception
to admit it. I wasn't going to admit it.
Yeah,
no.
We talk a lot about horse. Yeah, we talk a lot about horse racing and significant changes. I didn't want to leave anything out there up in the air. So, at any rate, that'll do it for this week's edition of the Blitz. Bob, we'll have a lot to talk about next week, I'm sure.
All right.